I mentioned last time that this area is sort of radically different than what we've looked at so far, due to the colonization that takes place. I suppose you could argue that the Ottoman Empire colonized, this area of sort of West Africa, West Asia, but in reality, the Ottomans were pretty low key about change. One of the things about more, what you might call more traditional colonial activities, is that you take over a place, but you don't really get involved in changing them. You just want to control them. You want to take over their resources, take over their labor, and then you just sort of, as long as they're willing to sort of toe the line of what you told them to do, then you pretty much just sort of leave them their own devices as long as they, pay their taxes, do X, Y, Z, or whatever it is. And that's pretty much traditional empires. The one exception to that would have been the Roman Empire, where they're really, really big on the idea that you had to become Roman. And I suppose that provides the model, because that's when the Europeans start to empire, when they start to build their colonial empires from the 1500s on. It's largely within that same context as the Romans. Unlike the Ottoman Empire, when they take over this whole, chunk of here, they're not really interested in those people becoming Ottoman Turks. In fact, they pretty much don't want them to, which is also very typical what you see in China when China expands and takes over other regions traditionally. You can learn how to function with the Chinese, but the Chinese aren't interested in converting you into like sort of baby version of themselves traditionally. So when the Europeans come in here, this is the first area they take over. Now then, the Portuguese are the first into the game, and they had set up colonies on the coastal regions of India and, as we'll see later, Southeast Asia. The Dutch come in after them, pretty much take over the Portuguese colonies. Then the big players come in, and that's the French and the British. And by the time the dust is settled on all this, after the French and British go at it in the 1700s, the end result is the British control pretty much the Indian Ocean. And at that point, what that means is they control basically, your surface access to this whole region. And why that becomes important is at the same point in time, the British Empire, which was, of course, a political entity, it's the United Kingdom, had also sort of spun off a commercial empire. And this becomes called the British East India Company. And you can see right there, this idea of East Asia, East, and then India fitted into one thing. This was actually based on an earlier Dutch model, the Dutch East Indian Company. Feel free to look at that. Though when the Dutch were talking about, they were talking about Southeast Asia. In the British case, as they set up colonies here in the coastal areas of India, they're talking about basically what we would now call India and Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And so the thing sort of surreal about this, because we tend to think of multinationals and sort of enormous, corporate systems as being a, late 20th century, 21st century phenomena. But the British East India Company by the 1750s, 1770s, basically has a monopoly on a bunch of stuff. Most famously, it would be silk and tea, most especially tea. And you have to remember, people didn't drink tea prior to the 1700s. In fact, coffee, of course, which comes from the New World, is a a new thing in the 1600s. Coffee shops and then tea shops, or tea bar, I guess bistros, I don't know what you call them, or a huge new novelty in the 1700s. But by the mid 1700s, because they control this ocean, and the interesting thing is, though the ocean's controlled by the British Empire, i.e. the British government, the reality is a lot of it was actually patrolled and run by the British East India Company. So this company, which originally starts, just a commercial enterprise, very quickly ends up with a small and ever-growing navy. They end up with a huge number of ships moving goods and sources back and forth, especially between India and England, but then also India and the other British colonies, which includes Canada, and of course at that period also it's now the United States, etc. So by the 1700s, of course, they're in the business of making money. So one of the things they start to promote is the idea of the consumption of tea. So by the mid 1700s, because they have a monopoly, they're doing really well. They've convinced everyone that they should drink tea, which is still, of course, even today, is sort of a British stereotype. And this includes the British colonial possessions. And in fact, the tax on tea and the expense that the North American colonies had to pay to get tea was, of course, the Boston Tea Party, and one of the, maybe not the major, but one of the, sore points between the North American colonies, which become the United States, and the British government in England, is the extra tax on tea. And the thing about this is the ships where they threw the tea off of weren't British Navy ships. They were British East India ships. But the British East India Company did something that was very, very clever, and then even today's terms is sort of terrifying. Right when they started shop in the late 16, early 1700s, they intentionally gave the King of England shares in the company. In other words, this is one of the first share-held companies in the world. And what they also did is they decided to start the idea of insurance, with the idea where you would actually, people would pay an amount of money every year, and what you would do is you would insure their stuff. And the main thing that British East India Company insured was ships. And this became Lloyd's of London, which is still the world's oldest insurance company. It's still, I believe, one of, if not the largest, one of the largest in the world. And one of their specialties right from the get-go was and still is insuring ships. So the London Stock Exchange largely starts because of the British East India Company. Lloyd's and the idea of insurance starts as the British East India Company. And the idea that tea is something you want and should drink, and it's a sign of status and a whole mess of other stuff, is again the British East India Company. And because the British government, specifically the British Crown or the royal family, actually has shares in the company, which was very clever, because it means if anyone decides, like if the French decide they're going to go, shoot up British East India ships, then the British East India Company can actually call on the Royal Navy, complain to the king, and the king's going to tell the Royal Navy, get your butts over there and then sort this crap out. Because my investments are being damaged. So there was no separation between commercial and government. They were the same thing. Now, where this becomes really key then is the British East India Company, because they're trying to constantly make more money. And what that means, at least initially, is they're actually the big colonizing influence of the British in this part of the world. It isn't so much the British government. The British government probably had no idea what they were going to do with India, as long as they had a few ports. But the British East India Company really realized very quickly that, one, there was a huge number of people in India. There was a lot of stuff in India. And if you controlled that, you not only controlled the labor of the people in India, but you could then sell all that stuff to the rest of the world, build factories to make more people work on it, et cetera, and of course, grow tea. Tea, of course, originally comes from East Asia, specifically China. The British very quickly import it and then start planting it in India, especially in the northern regions up here. And then India very quickly becomes, one of the great tea producers in the world. China didn't want to trade with the Europeans, very specifically the British East India Company. As we'll see later, that gets them in trouble in the 19th century. But by then, the BEIC doesn't really care, because they've got tea, they've got India, and all the tea in India is theirs. So if you want tea, you buy it from them, which means they're like, in fact, they were drug dealers. We'll get into that later in the semester. But I mean, tea was sort of like the drug of choice, if you would, in the 1700s, and they had a monopoly on it to all intents and purposes. Now, what that meant is, because they become interested in expansion, both just because they want to protect their markets, but also to expand their markets, very quickly they start bribing and doing deals with local rulers, especially in this western coast of India. And in that process, build up an army. First, it's sort of like a security force, like the Securitas guys here, to protect their investments. But then later they start building a larger army. And by the late 1700s, early 1800s, they've got a full-on army. By the late 1700s, under guys like Clive and such like that, they actually engage in major military campaigns against local rulers, and win. And so by the early parts of the 19th century, the British East India Company pretty much controls all of southern India and Sri Lanka, not the government of India, but the British East India Company. So what you have as a corporate entity basically controls, by then already a good chunk of the world's population and a good chunk of the southern subcontinent. They then expand that control, of course, always with the support of the British government, because you can't keep the two apart. And so what you get is the BEIC and the British government basically by the 1740s, early 1750s, control everything from southern Afghanistan, southern Iran, all the way over here through basically Nepal and through Bangladesh. And very quickly after that also end up taking over what's now Myanmar. All part of this thing, but all part of the British East India Company / British government. Now this all blows up in 1850, I'm going to say 1857, I can't remember exactly when there's this enormous revolt in the northern part by the BEIC army. In other words, the soldiers who were all pretty much sort of like Indian mercenaries that were fighting for the company basically get upset about company pay, the way that they're treated, The fact that the British, including the BEIC very specifically, have tried to make them Christian. In other words, rather than leaving them alone, sort of like the Ottomans do, they're actually trying to convert them into sort of a version of the Brits. And this all just blows up in this vicious, absolutely brutal mutiny, they call it, of the military forces in northern India against their guys that run them. So the British military gets sent in, and huge cost of life. They end up, retaking the whole area. And at that point, the British government decides that the BEIC is a really bad idea in terms of running things. They're fine as a commercial establishment, but they should not be in control of territory. And actually, if you read the stuff in the period, it's a good example of why corporations should not be in control of government. It's just surreally bad. And so the end result is by 1857, 1858, the British government take over all this area from the BEIC. The BEIC gets broken down into a smaller chunk of companies. Just as a trivial pursuit, the last big chunk that I know that's left is Matheson and Jardine, which was, and I think still is based in Hong Kong, but I believe they're moving their operations to Singapore. And they're still one of the world's largest shippers of goods and services. So the BEIC doesn't actually vanish. It sort of splinters up, I think, into 3 or 4 different entities. But I think you'd have to check on Google. I think they've still got offices in London. So you end up in this one, here it is, mid-19th century. The American revolutions happened. The American Civil War hasn't happened yet. And you have a corporate entity that at a moment in time in, say, 1850, controls maybe 1/6 of the world's population, probably actually more than like 1/5 of the world population, because not just India, it's also this whole area here is under a corporation. And so when we think of modern corporations, they're actually pretty small. Even something like Facebook or Microsoft is pretty small compared to the BEIC, because these guys literally had a monopoly, and they actually physically controlled a large chunk of the world's population under the corporate umbrella of the BEIC. So it's sort of a fascinating example of sort of what you might call corporate history. But the reason that it becomes really key is in this area, what you get is very different than what goes off to the west. There's no interest in the populations here in their original form. It's out of the scene. Basically, it's making money. So even when the British government takes over this part of the world, they still see it pretty much in the same way. India is sort of a pain in the butt to manage, but you can make a lot of money out of it. So when the British go into this area, they go into this very much sort of like, and I think they probably, my guess would be, is they probably use the Romans as their model. You have to remember, Europe was very, very big, especially Western Europe was very, very big and sort of like being the new Rome. The French, the British, the Germans, all these folks wanted to be like the new Romans. And so when the British set up their empire, what they're doing is they decide, fairly early on, by late 1700s, that they're not going to leave the folks in India to pursue their cultural activities, and especially their religious activities. They can pursue them as long as they're not in conflict with British values and attitudes. So several things occur simultaneously. One is that certain religious activities, especially conservative Hindu activities about the suti, the idea that basically widows have to be burned at the pyres of their husbands when the husbands die. The idea of a fixed caste system with your untouchable caste. The British find these as unacceptable. And now that they actually run India, they basically tell you guys, you can't do that anymore. So they actually interfere in the religious activities that were part of, a large part, in fact, in some cases, the majority population of this particular region, which again was one of the reasons why the mutiny occurs in 1857, when the Indians sort of come to the realization it's not just a flag flying and a guy who pays the bills. They actually want to change you. So when the dust settles from all that, the British pursue this same process. Now, one of the side effects they also do is because India alone, not including Sri Lanka or Pakistan, is an incredibly complicated place. 3 major world religions have started here. Hindu religion starts here, Buddhism starts in the north, and your Sikh religion starts in the west. So this is a tremendous, of course, the Muslims come in huge numbers and take over large chunks of India in the 1400s on. So this is an incredibly complicated place. A tremendous number of ethnic and cultural diversity, tremendous linguistic diversity. And then, of course, you throw in Pakistan, southern Afghanistan, eastern Iran, Nepal, all the rest of this. And the British are just going around like, we aren't going to learn these languages. So they basically tell everyone here, well, the way it's going to happen from now on is you guys are going to learn English. We don't care what you guys speak at home. But if you're going to get anything done, if you're going to do anything, even for example, if you get arrested or a cop wants to ask you a question, you better be able to answer in English. And so what happens is they basically tell the entire population, this whole chunk, large parts of South Asia, you're never going to be English because you're the wrong color, you're from the wrong place, et cetera, et cetera. But the only system you're going to have is the British system. And to a certain extent, as we'll see later, the French do exactly the same thing in Southeast Asia. The Dutch do exactly the same thing in what's now Highland Southeast Asia, Indonesia. And so this becomes the model for colonialism. To a certain extent, we don't see quite the same thing in Canada, well, in North America, Canadian and American colonies. So because you didn't have a large indigenous population to deal with, you pretty much just wipe them out. But here, you're not going to wipe out the population of India. What you want to do is use them. You see this as an incredibly cheap, incredibly efficient labor source, and you want to maximize their utility. So you want to maximize your profit, minimize your cost. And that's the classic colonial model of the last couple of 100 years right down till today. So this area gets hugely impacted by the British. Other groups in here, of course, in the northern region, what happens is the Russians come in later, in basically the late 1700s through the 1800s. Well, I guess actually it's about the same period the British get control of this area. And they do exactly the same thing up here in the north. So a little bit of Afghanistan, but Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, etc. All that falls under the Russian, Imperial Russia, and they basically pursue the same policy as the Brits. You can do whatever you want to as long as we like it. But you're going to learn Russian, and we're no interest in what your cultures are. But if there's anything you guys do we don't like, you're stopping it right now. So this isn't like negotiating. This is like negotiating with a very large gun pointed at the other guy. And so these become your two major players in this part of the world. The Russian influence to the north, the British influence to the south. This gets very, very complicated. And ironically, you still see it even in 2022 in Iran and Afghanistan, because they end up being sort of like the rope in a tug of war game between the Russians to the north and the British to the south. And both sides spill, I don't know how many gallons of blood over the last, 150 years or 200 years in this region. The Russians, of course, invade Afghanistan, I think it's 1979, and get their butts handed to them about 10 years later and stagger back. In fact, the collapse in Afghanistan of the Russian army was one of the major reasons for the collapse of the USSR. So this is an area where you basically had two big players. The big players come in the last 200, 250 years, and basically just put their huge boom, just a big stamp in this whole region. And that has an enormous impact on how people identify themselves in this region, and also how they identify their neighbors. Just as the last point, you have to remember when you get into there, and this is very typical of colonial systems, which we're going to see from now on, is you have to remember if you're the Indians and you really want to be independent, oftentimes independence gets talked about in terms of getting rid of the Brits. And this is one area where the United States was a little bit different, because in the United States, you already had a philosophy for what change you wanted to turn things into. And then you have to get rid of the Brits to do it. In most of the rest of the world, what you do is the first thing you want is independence. And then when you can sort of like, okay, now we've got independence, now what we want to do. And so if you think about it, that's like going to, Hawaiian Airlines at the Honolulu airport and saying, okay, I want to go on a vacation. And they're going to go, yeah, okay, as long as you got a credit card, that's fine, where you want to go. And then you sort of stop and think, geez, I don't know. So this is actually what happened in most of the world. This is certainly true, especially we'll see in Africa in the 20th and 21st century. That's also very, very true in this part of the world, is that independence became what people wanted. But in large part, what they wanted to do was overthrow the guys that were in charge of them, but they hadn't really thought through what they wanted as an end goal. And the problem you get into is once you get the independence, then if you've got a bunch of different groups, and India is a classic case in point, is every single group probably has a very different idea what the end goal should be. But you can almost guarantee in every case, the end goal should be them in charge. And all of a sudden, all these groups start looking at each other. Now the Brits are gone, it's 1947, and they're sort of like, yeah, I think I should be in charge. No, I think I should be in charge. And then all of a sudden, then you've got, in many cases, a civil war, ironically, post-independence. And sad to say, this is very, very much the norm as sort of what you might call the aftermath of European-style colonialism. The Europeans make themselves so disliked in their colonial empires that everyone in those empires becomes so fixated on getting rid of them that they very rarely, in many cases, think through what they want next. And so in many cases, when you look at sovereignty movements, they're more about getting independence, but in many cases, they're not really sovereignty movements in the sense of, well, when we get this, we're going to do that. And that is a very detailed, very clearly mapped idea of what the world's going to be like after the colonial masters are gone. And in South Asia is the first place we see that, and they're still dealing with the ramifications now, because the way this ends up is this whole chunk here, which was British India in a very specific way, basically 4 countries, or what's now 4 countries. When the Brits leave 1947, the Brits sort of vaguely try to set this up so everyone's going to meet around a large table and everyone's going to sort of decide what they want to do, and they're going to stay one thing or da 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 da. But the reality is they had never been one thing at all till the Brits showed up and basically hammered it into them. And so when the British leave, basically the largely Muslim population in the Pakistan region says, we want a Muslim state. The largely Hindu population in the large part of India, including the Sikhs, says, well, we don't want to be Muslim. And then the Sikhs and the Hindus get into it in terms of what they want to be, which is still going on. The guys in the East, which again a modern Muslim region, say, we want to be Muslim too. And the folks in the South, who are sort of split almost half and half between Hindus in the North and Muslims in the South, basically can't decide. So the end result is this whole thing falls apart. In fact, they call it the partition of India, 1947. Muslim, in fact, this becomes West Pakistan and this becomes East Pakistan, what's now Bangladesh. Sri Lanka starts sort of staggering into a civil war, which is still ongoing as of today. And then India sort of becomes the Hindu centerpiece. Not surprisingly, having a country split in 2 by another, not friendly country in between, falls apart eventually, and Bangladesh becomes an independent state. But I should point out that India and Pakistan are technically at war. Well, they're sort of at war. Bangladesh and Pakistan were at war, and then Bangladesh and India were at war. And I'm not sure. I think they're not at war anymore, but you need to check every week to see what the latest news is. And so what you get is this area just fragments, and very barely, if you're the Indian prime minister, you have a very limited amount of control over the country of India, because a lot of it still wants to fragment even more because the British are gone.